Question 1. Comparative studies suggest that client relationships can be complex, especially when a client's immediate desires may not align with regulatory best practices. NOV Financial has a long-standing client, Mr. Harrison, who has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of his portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that has recently experienced a surge in trading activity, driven by social media trends. Mr. Harrison is aware of the risks, but insists that NOV Financial facilitate this investment immediately, citing potential for rapid gains. Considering the regulatory framework governing financial advisory services, which of the following actions by NOV Financial demonstrates the most appropriate and compliant response? Option A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to determine if the proposed investment aligns with Mr. Harrison's stated financial goals, risk tolerance, and overall financial situation, and then discuss the findings and potential regulatory implications with him, offering compliant alternatives if necessary. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Harrison, emphasizing the potential upside and assuring him that his instructions are being followed. Option C. Execute the trade immediately to capture the current market momentum, and then inform Mr. Harrison of the transaction and its associated risks. Option D. Decline the investment outright without further discussion, citing internal policy restrictions without explaining the specific regulatory concerns. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Harrison, emphasizing the potential upside and assuring him that his instructions are being followed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory breaches or unethical practices. The firm, NOV Financial, must navigate this by prioritizing its regulatory obligations and ethical duties above all else, even when faced with a potentially lucrative client request. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with adherence to the strict regulatory framework governing financial advice and operations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the rules governing client suitability, disclosure, and the prevention of market abuse. This approach prioritizes client best interest by ensuring that any recommended investment strategy is appropriate for their circumstances and risk tolerance, and that all potential conflicts of interest or regulatory risks are clearly communicated. This aligns with the fundamental principles of fiduciary duty and regulatory compliance, ensuring that NOV Financial operates with integrity and upholds the trust placed in it by clients and regulators. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate client satisfaction without due diligence risks significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential harm to the client. For instance, proceeding with a strategy that is not suitable for the client's risk profile, even if requested, violates the principle of acting in the client's best interest and could lead to breaches of conduct rules. Similarly, failing to disclose potential conflicts of interest or material risks associated with an investment, or engaging in practices that could be construed as market manipulation, directly contravenes anti-fraud and market integrity regulations. Such actions demonstrate a disregard for professional ethics and regulatory requirements, exposing both the individual advisor and NOV Financial to severe consequences. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly identify the client's request and underlying objectives. Second, rigorously assess the request against all applicable regulatory requirements, internal policies, and ethical guidelines. Third, identify any potential conflicts, risks, or regulatory breaches. Fourth, communicate transparently with the client, explaining any limitations or concerns and proposing alternative compliance strategies. If the client remains insistent on a non-compliant course of action, the professional must be prepared to decline the business while maintaining a professional demeanor. Question 2. The audit findings indicate a potential breach of data privacy regulations by NOV hiring assessment tests data processing activities. The findings suggest that certain candidate personal data may have been accessed by unauthorized personnel. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for NOV hiring assessment test? Option A. Delay any formal notification to the regulatory authority until the internal investigation is fully completed and all remediation steps have been implemented. Option B. Advise the audit team to disregard the findings as they are preliminary and may not represent a definitive breach. Option C. Immediately report the potential breach to the regulatory authority without conducting any internal investigation to ensure full compliance with reporting timelines. Option D. Immediately initiate a thorough internal investigation into the alleged data breach and prepare to notify the relevant regulatory authority within the legally mandated timeframe, while also reviewing and strengthening internal data security protocols. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a thorough internal investigation into the alleged data breach and prepare to notify the relevant regulatory authority within the legally mandated timeframe, while also reviewing and strengthening internal data security protocols. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need to address a potential compliance breach with the company's established internal procedures and the need for thorough investigation. The pressure to act quickly must be tempered by the requirement for due diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations regarding reporting and internal controls. The correct approach involves initiating an internal investigation immediately upon discovery of the audit findings, while simultaneously preparing to notify the relevant regulatory body within the stipulated timeframe. This demonstrates proactive compliance and a commitment to transparency, specifically under the regulatory framework for the NOV hiring assessment test, assuming this refers to a specific, internal regulatory framework for the assessment itself, which would govern its own hiring processes. The company is expected to have robust internal controls and reporting mechanisms. Prompt internal investigation ensures that the nature and extent of the potential breach are understood, allowing for a more accurate and comprehensive report to the regulatory authority. This aligns with the principle of good corporate governance and regulatory adherence, which prioritizes timely and accurate disclosure of potential issues. An incorrect approach would be to delay reporting to the regulatory body, while solely focusing on internal remediation, without initiating the formal investigation process. This failure to act promptly on potential breaches, even while investigating internally, could be seen as a violation of reporting obligations and a lack of commitment to regulatory oversight. Another incorrect approach would be to report the findings to the regulatory body without conducting any internal investigation. This would be premature and could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate report, potentially causing unnecessary alarm or misrepresenting the situation. It also bypasses the company's responsibility to first understand the issue internally. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the audit findings altogether, hoping they go unnoticed. This is a clear dereliction of duty and a direct violation of regulatory expectations for compliance and risk management. Professionals in similar situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Immediately assessing the severity and potential impact of the audit findings. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies and regulatory guidelines to understand reporting obligations and timelines. 3. Initiating an internal investigation to gather facts and understand the root cause. 4. Preparing a preliminary report for the regulatory body based on initial findings, with a commitment to provide further details as the investigation progresses. 5. Documenting all steps taken and communications made. This systematic approach ensures that all regulatory and ethical obligations are met while maintaining operational integrity. Question 3. Regulatory review indicates that a client of NOV Tech Investments, MS, Alina Vance, has explicitly requested to invest a significant portion of her portfolio into a highly speculative, illiquid private equity fund. MS. Vance states she has heard positive things about the fund from friends and is eager to participate. As a financial advisor at NOV Tech Investments, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and act in MS. Vance's best interest? Option A. Proceed with the investment after MS. Vance signs a waiver acknowledging the risks involved. Option B. Inform MS. Vance that NOV Tech Investments does not offer such speculative investments and decline her request. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment to determine if the private equity fund aligns with MS. Vance's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments before proceeding. Option D. Immediately execute MS. Vance's investment request as per her explicit instruction. Correct answer is D. Immediately execute MS. Vance's investment request as per her explicit instructions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the firm's regulatory obligations. NOV hiring assessment test candidates must demonstrate an understanding of their fiduciary duty and the regulatory framework governing client interaction, specifically concerning the suitability of investment recommendations. The firm, NOV Investments, is obligated to act in the best interest of its clients, which necessitates a thorough assessment of suitability, not simply adherence to a client's expressed desire for a specific product without proper due diligence. The correct approach involves conducting a comprehensive suitability assessment before proceeding with the client's request. This means NOV Investments must gather detailed information about the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments. Only after this assessment can the firm determine if the requested investment is appropriate. This aligns with regulatory principles that mandate advisors to recommend investments that are suitable for their clients, preventing them from making unsuitable recommendations even if requested. This approach upholds the firm's duty of care and regulatory compliance, ensuring client protection. An incorrect approach would be to immediately execute the client's request without any further investigation. This fails to uphold the firm's fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations. It prioritizes client instruction over client well-being and regulatory compliance, potentially exposing both the client and the firm to significant risks. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying reasons or offering alternative, suitable options. This demonstrates a lack of client service and a failure to engage in a constructive dialogue to find a mutually beneficial solution within regulatory boundaries. A third incorrect approach might involve providing a superficial suitability check that merely rubber stamps the client's request without genuine analysis, which still falls short of the required due diligence and regulatory standards. Professionals should approach such situations by first acknowledging the client's request and then clearly communicating the firm's process, emphasizing the importance of suitability. They should then proceed with a thorough fact-finding exercise, explaining how the gathered information will inform the recommendation. If the requested investment is deemed unsuitable, professionals should explain why, referencing specific risks or misalignments with the client's profile, and then propose suitable alternatives that meet the client's objectives. This structured, client-centric, and regulation-aware process ensures both compliance and client trust. Question 4. Consider a scenario where a prospective client, seeking to open an account with NOV hiring assessment test, provides documentation that appears incomplete or inconsistent with standard onboarding procedures. The client expresses urgency and suggests that the firm should trust them and expedite the process, implying that further scrutiny is unnecessary and potentially indicative of a lack of confidence. The firm's compliance department has flagged the discrepancies. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound and compliant approach for NOV hiring assessment test to take? Option A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that all onboarding procedures must be followed meticulously, referencing the specific regulatory requirements and internal policies that necessitate thorough due diligence, and offer to assist them in gathering any missing or clarifying information. Option B. Expedite the account opening process by accepting the provided documentation at face value, assuming the client's urgency implies a need for discretion and that further questioning might alienate them. Option C. Proceed with opening the account as requested by the client, prioritizing client satisfaction and the potential for future business, while making a mental note to conduct a more thorough review at a later, less busy time. Option D. Inform the client that their request cannot be accommodated due to the perceived lack of transparency and suggest they seek services elsewhere, without providing specific details about the regulatory or policy reasons. The correct answer is A. Politely but firmly explain to the client that all onboarding procedures must be followed meticulously, referencing the specific regulatory requirements and internal policies that necessitate thorough due diligence, and offer to assist them in gathering any missing or clarifying information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory breaches or unethical conduct. The firm, NOV hiring assessment test, must navigate this by prioritizing its regulatory obligations and ethical duties above client demands when those demands are in conflict. Careful judgment is required to identify the point at which a client request crosses the line into non-compliance or unethical behavior. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the guidelines governing client onboarding and due diligence as mandated by the NOV hiring assessment, tests internal policies, and any applicable external regulations. When a client's request, such as the one described, appears to circumvent or directly contravene these established procedures, the professional response is to clearly articulate the regulatory limitations and ethical boundaries to the client. This approach upholds the firm's integrity, protects it from potential penalties, and ensures it operates within the bounds of professional conduct. It demonstrates a commitment to compliance and ethical practice, which are paramount in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without adequate scrutiny, or to attempt to find loopholes that compromise the spirit of the regulations. This could involve overlooking discrepancies in documentation or accepting unsubstantiated explanations for the client's circumstances. Such actions would constitute a failure to adhere to due diligence requirements, potentially exposing the firm to risks associated with money laundering, fraud, or other illicit activities. Ethically, it would represent a dereliction of duty to both the client and the broader financial system. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without a clear, reasoned explanation based on regulatory or ethical grounds. While the request may be problematic, a professional response requires clear communication of the reasons for refusal, referencing specific policies or regulations. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the client's request and its potential implications. Second, consult the relevant internal policies and external regulations to determine if the request aligns with established standards. Third, if there is a conflict, clearly and professionally communicate the regulatory or ethical reasons why the request cannot be fulfilled as presented. Fourth, explore alternative compliant ways to meet the client's underlying needs, if possible. Finally, document the interaction and the decision-making process thoroughly. Question 5. Strategic planning requires Novus Financial to consider expanding its services into a new international market. The proposed market has a different regulatory environment and consumer protection laws than its current operating jurisdiction. The senior management team is eager to capitalize on this growth opportunity quickly. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethics for Novus Financial? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory and compliance risk assessment of the new market, identifying all applicable laws, regulations, and reporting obligations, and develop a detailed plan to ensure adherence before launching services. Option B. Focus solely on the commercial viability and potential profitability of the new market, deferring any detailed regulatory review until after the initial launch and client acquisition phase. Option C. Prioritize immediate market entry to gain first-mover advantage, assuming that existing internal compliance procedures will be sufficient and addressing any regulatory issues as they arise. Option D. Rely exclusively on the legal and compliance advice provided by the local partners in the new market to navigate its regulatory landscape, without conducting independent verification. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory and compliance risk assessment of the new market, identifying all applicable laws, regulations, and reporting obligations, and develop a detailed plan to ensure adherence before launching services. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's strategic growth objectives with its regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities. The pressure to expand market share can lead to overlooking potential compliance risks. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any expansion strategy is not only commercially viable, but also fully compliant with the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, Handbook, and the principles of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, CISI, Code of Conduct. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough and documented risk assessment of the proposed expansion into the new market. This includes identifying all relevant regulatory requirements in the target jurisdiction, understanding potential compliance gaps, and developing mitigation strategies. This approach is best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical conduct, aligning with FCA principles for businesses, particularly Principle 3. A firm must take reasonable care to ensure its systems and controls are adequate to manage its business effectively, honestly, and with a degree of due skill and care, and SISI Code of Conduct Principle 1. Act with integrity at all times. A proactive and documented risk assessment ensures that Novus Financial is not only aware of, but also prepared to manage potential regulatory pitfalls, thereby protecting both the firm and its clients. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate market entry without adequate due diligence fails to uphold regulatory standards. This would be a direct contravention of FCA Principle 7. A firm must pay due regard to the information needs of its clients and communicate information to them in a way that is clear, fair, and not misleading, and SISI Code of Conduct Principle 3. Act with due skill, care, and diligence. Rushing into a new market without understanding local regulations, consumer protection laws, or reporting requirements exposes Novus Financial to significant legal and reputational risks, including potential fines and sanctions from regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on the advice of local partners without independent verification is also professionally unacceptable. While local expertise is valuable, Novus Financial retains ultimate responsibility for its compliance. This oversight would violate FCA Principle 2. A firm must conduct its business with the utmost care and diligence, and SISI Code of Conduct Principle 2. Act with integrity and in the best interests of your clients. It demonstrates a lack of robust internal controls and a failure to exercise due diligence, which could lead to significant compliance breaches if the local partner's advice is incomplete or inaccurate. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the strategic objective. Second, identify all applicable regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines. Third, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, considering both internal capabilities and external factors. Fourth, develop and implement appropriate controls and mitigation strategies. Fifth, ensure thorough documentation of all steps and decisions. Finally, establish ongoing monitoring and review mechanisms to adapt to changing regulatory landscapes and business needs. Question 6. The investigation demonstrates that NOV Financial has received credible allegations of market manipulation concerning trading activities conducted on behalf of its key client, Global Innovations Inc. The firm's senior management is aware that Global Innovations Inc. represents a significant portion of NOV's annual revenue. Considering the potential financial impact of losing this client, what is the most appropriate course of action for NOV Financial to take in response to these allegations, strictly adhering to the FCA handbook and professional ethical standards? Option A. Rely on assurances from Global Innovations Inc. that no market manipulation has occurred and continue trading as usual, focusing on maintaining the client relationship. Option B. Immediately cease all trading activities for Global Innovations Inc. and terminate the client relationship to mitigate any potential regulatory risk to NOV Financial. Option C. Initiate a limited internal review, focusing only on documentation that supports the client's innocence, and present these findings to the FCA to close the matter quickly. Option D. Conduct a thorough, independent, and objective investigation into the allegations, involving the compliance department and legal counsel, and take appropriate action based on the findings, regardless of the client's revenue contribution. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough, independent, and objective investigation into the allegations, involving the compliance department and legal counsel, and take appropriate action based on the findings, regardless of the client's revenue contribution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to retain a valuable client and its obligation to uphold regulatory standards and ethical conduct. The firm, NOV Financial, must navigate the delicate balance of providing sound advice while ensuring compliance with the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) handbook, specifically focusing on principles related to client best interests and market integrity. The pressure to maintain a profitable relationship with Global Innovations Inc. could tempt individuals to overlook or downplay potential regulatory breaches, making objective judgment and adherence to established procedures paramount. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation into the allegations, prioritizing regulatory compliance and client best interests above commercial considerations. This entails gathering all relevant evidence, consulting with the firm's compliance department and legal counsel, and acting decisively based on the findings, even if it risks jeopardizing the client relationship. This aligns with the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 1, Integrity, Principle 2, Skill, Care, and Diligence, and Principle 3, Management and Control, which mandate that firms act with integrity, exercise due skill, care, and diligence, and have adequate systems and controls in place to ensure compliance. Furthermore, the concept of treating customers fairly, TCF, is implicitly violated if the firm fails to address potential misconduct that could harm clients or market integrity. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the allegations without a proper investigation due to the client's importance. This demonstrates a failure to uphold Principle 1, Integrity, and Principle 3, Management and Control, by not having adequate systems to identify and address potential misconduct. It also risks violating Principle 2, Skill, Care, and Diligence, by not acting with the necessary thoroughness. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial investigation that selectively gathers evidence to support a predetermined outcome favorable to the client. This constitutes a serious breach of integrity and a failure to act in the client's best interests, potentially leading to significant regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach would be to immediately terminate the relationship without due process or investigation, which, while seemingly cautious, could be seen as an overreaction, and a failure to exercise due care and diligence in assessing the situation and the client's potential for remediation. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and its potential regulatory implications. This should be followed by a comprehensive information gathering phase, involving all relevant stakeholders and documentation. Crucially, the firm's compliance and legal departments must be engaged early and continuously. The decision-making process must be guided by the firm's internal policies, the FCA handbook, and ethical considerations, ensuring that all actions are defensible and aligned with regulatory expectations. If a breach is identified, a proportionate and appropriate response must be implemented, prioritizing remediation and preventing recurrence. Question 7. The analysis reveals that a prospective client of NOV hiring assessment test has requested a specific structuring of their engagement that, while seemingly beneficial to them, appears to circumvent certain disclosure requirements mandated by the regulatory framework governing NOV hiring assessment test operations. The client is insistent on this structure, believing it to be a standard practice. What is the most appropriate course of action for NOV hiring assessment test in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the client's requested structure, assuming their understanding of standard practices is accurate and that regulatory scrutiny will be minimal. Option B. Clearly explain to the client the specific regulatory requirements that the requested structure may contravene, and propose alternative compliant methods to achieve their underlying objectives. Option C. Advise the client to seek independent legal counsel to validate their proposed structure, and then proceed if counsel deems it acceptable, regardless of NOV hiring assessment test's internal assessment of regulatory compliance. Option D. Politely decline the engagement, citing a lack of alignment with NOV hiring assessment test service offerings, without detailing the specific regulatory concerns. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the client's requested structure, assuming their understanding of standard practices is accurate and that regulatory scrutiny will be minimal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory noncompliance or ethical breaches. The firm, NOV hiring assessment test, must navigate this by prioritizing its regulatory obligations and ethical duties above client demands that could compromise these. Careful judgment is required to balance client service with adherence to the law and professional standards. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the guidelines applicable to NOV hiring assessment test, and applying them to the client's request. This means identifying any potential conflicts with these regulations, and then communicating these concerns clearly and professionally to the client, offering compliant alternatives. This upholds the firm's integrity and ensures it operates within legal and ethical boundaries. An incorrect approach that involves directly fulfilling the client's request without considering regulatory implications would be a failure to exercise due diligence and a breach of professional responsibility. This could expose both the client and NOV hiring assessment test to significant legal and reputational risks. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the client's request outright without exploring compliance solutions, might be perceived as poor client service and could miss opportunities to find mutually agreeable outcomes within the regulatory framework. A third incorrect approach, which is to proceed with the client's request while attempting to conceal the non-compliant aspects, constitutes deliberate deception and a severe ethical and regulatory violation. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core of the client's objective. Then, they must cross-reference this objective against all applicable regulations and ethical codes. If a conflict arises, the professional should clearly articulate the regulatory constraints to the client and proactively propose alternative, compliant strategies that still aim to achieve the client's underlying goals. This iterative process of understanding, assessing, communicating, and problem-solving ensures both client satisfaction and regulatory adherence. Question 8. The audit findings indicate that during the onboarding of a new client for NOV Capital, a junior analyst was instructed by their direct manager to proceed with the account opening, despite the client's provided identification documents appearing incomplete according to the firm's standard Know Your Customer (KIC) procedures. The manager stated, "Just get it done. I'll take responsibility if there's an issue." The junior analyst is aware that NOV Capital operates under strict regulatory guidelines for client verification. What is the most appropriate course of action for the junior analyst? Option A. Proceed with the onboarding but make a note in the client file that the manager instructed them to do so despite incomplete documentation. Option B. Politely explain to the manager that the documentation appears incomplete and request clarification on how to proceed in compliance with NOV Capital's KYC procedures, potentially escalating to the compliance department if necessary. Option C. Proceed with the onboarding as instructed by the manager, relying on the manager's assurance of responsibility. Option D. Immediately refuse to process the onboarding and inform the manager that they will not proceed due to regulatory concerns. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the onboarding as instructed by the manager, relying on the manager's assurance of responsibility. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a conflict between a direct instruction from a superior and a potential breach of regulatory requirements. The pressure to comply with a manager's directive, especially when it seems to expedite a process, can be significant. However, adherence to the regulatory framework is paramount, and overlooking or misinterpreting these requirements can lead to severe consequences for both the individual and the firm. Careful judgment is required to identify the discrepancy and determine the appropriate course of action without jeopardizing compliance. The correct approach involves seeking clarification and ensuring all regulatory requirements are met before proceeding. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and professional integrity. Specifically, it requires the individual to understand the relevant regulatory guidance concerning client onboarding and due diligence, and to recognize when a deviation from standard procedure might indicate a compliance risk. By proactively addressing the discrepancy with the compliance department, the individual upholds their responsibility to the regulatory framework and protects the firm from potential penalties. This aligns with the principles of acting with integrity and due skill, care, and diligence, as expected under professional standards. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the onboarding without verifying the client's identity and documentation, despite the manager's instruction. This bypasses essential due diligence procedures, which are mandated by regulations to prevent financial crime and ensure the integrity of the financial system. Such an action would be a direct violation of regulatory obligations and could expose the firm to significant risks, including fines, reputational damage, and sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to directly refuse the manager's instruction without attempting to understand the underlying regulatory concern or seeking guidance. While the intention might be to avoid a breach, a complete refusal without a reasoned explanation or escalation can create internal friction and may not be the most constructive way to resolve the issue. A more professional response would involve explaining the regulatory concerns and proposing alternative compliance solutions. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to proceed with onboarding based on the manager's assurance that the documentation is sufficient, without independent verification against the established regulatory standards. This relies on subjective interpretation rather than objective compliance, which is a critical failure in a regulated environment. The responsibility for ensuring compliance rests with the individual performing the task, not solely on the assurance of a superior. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core regulatory requirement at stake. 2. Assessing the instruction against this requirement. 3. If a conflict or potential breach is identified, seeking clarification from the relevant internal department, e.g., compliance, legal, or referring to the specific regulatory guidance. 4. Documenting all communications and decisions. 5. Escalating the issue if a satisfactory resolution that ensures compliance cannot be reached through initial consultation. Question 9. To address the challenge of a potential conflict of interest arising from a new business opportunity that could impact an existing client, what is the most appropriate course of action for a NOV hiring assessment test candidate to recommend? Option A. Discuss the opportunity informally with a senior colleague to gauge their opinion before making any formal decision or disclosure. Option B. Decline the new business opportunity outright to avoid any perception of a conflict, without further investigation or client consultation. Option C. Immediately pursue the new business opportunity, as it represents potential growth for NOV, and address any client concerns if they arise later. Option D. Thoroughly assess the nature and extent of the potential conflict of interest, disclose it transparently to the existing client, and seek their informed consent before proceeding with the new business. The correct answer is C. Immediately pursue the new business opportunity, as it represents potential growth for NOV, and address any client concerns if they arise later. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for NOV hiring assessment test candidates by requiring them to navigate a situation involving potential conflicts of interest and the ethical obligation to act in the best interest of clients, while also adhering to regulatory requirements. The core difficulty lies in balancing the company's desire for new business with the fiduciary duty owed to existing clients, demanding careful judgment to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the existing client's interests and regulatory compliance. This means thoroughly assessing the potential conflict of interest, and if deemed significant, disclosing it transparently to the existing client, and seeking their informed consent before proceeding with any new business that might impact them. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principles of acting in the client's best interest and maintaining client confidentiality, as well as regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure of conflicts. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that involves immediately pursuing the new business opportunity without fully assessing the conflict or disclosing it to the existing client fails to uphold the fiduciary duty and could violate regulations concerning conflicts of interest and client disclosure. This demonstrates a disregard for client trust and regulatory obligations. An approach that involves declining the new business opportunity solely based on the potential for a conflict, without a thorough assessment or considering mitigation strategies like informed consent, might be overly cautious and could lead to missed legitimate business opportunities. While prioritizing client interests is crucial, a blanket refusal without due diligence is not always the most professional or compliant course of action. An approach that involves seeking advice from colleagues without a clear process for documenting the situation and the advice received, or without involving compliance personnel, risks informal or incomplete guidance. This can lead to inconsistent application of policies and potentially overlooked regulatory breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with potential conflicts of interest. This typically involves 1. Identifying the potential conflict. 2. Assessing the significance of the conflict and its potential impact on clients. 3. Consulting relevant company policies and regulatory guidelines. 4. Disclosing the conflict to affected parties and seeking informed consent where appropriate. 5. Documenting the entire process and the decision made. If in doubt, escalating the matter to the compliance department or senior management is essential. Question 10. The review process indicates that a long-standing client of NOV Financial, Mr. Harrison, has requested an immediate withdrawal of a significant portion of his investment portfolio, citing a desire to invest in a speculative, high-risk venture he recently learned about. Mr. Harrison has expressed impatience with the standard advisory process and insists that Nova Vest Financial execute the withdrawal without delay, stating he understands the risks involved. What is the most appropriate course of action for Nova Vest Financial in this situation? Option A. Execute the withdrawal as requested by Mr. Harrison, acknowledging his stated understanding of the risks. Option B. Engage Mr. Harrison in a detailed discussion to understand his motivations, assess his financial situation and objectives, and provide advice on whether the withdrawal and subsequent investment are suitable, offering alternatives if necessary. Option C. Decline the withdrawal request outright, informing Mr. Harrison that Nova Vest Financial will not facilitate such a high-risk investment. Option D. Advise Mr. Harrison to seek independent financial advice before proceeding with the withdrawal. Correct answer is A. Execute the withdrawal as requested by Mr. Harrison, acknowledging his stated understanding of the risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the firm's regulatory obligations. The firm, Nova Vest Financial, must navigate the delicate balance of client service while upholding its fiduciary duty and adhering to the stringent requirements of the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and relevant conduct of business sourcebook, COBS rules. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that any advice or action taken is in the client's best interest, even when that conflicts with the client's immediate, potentially ill-informed, request. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, followed by providing advice that aligns with these factors and regulatory expectations. This approach prioritizes the client's long-term well-being and compliance with FCA rules, particularly those concerning suitability and client best interests. Specifically, COBS 9A. 2. 1R mandates that firms must ensure that any investment advice given to a retail client is suitable for that client. This requires understanding the client's knowledge and experience, financial situation, and objectives. An incorrect approach would be to blindly follow the client's instructions without due diligence. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement of acting in the client's best interest and providing suitable advice. For instance, executing a transaction solely based on a client's request, without verifying its suitability or understanding the underlying rationale, could lead to significant financial harm to the client and expose Nova Vest Financial to regulatory sanctions for breaches of COBS 9A. 2. 1R and the overarching principle of treating customers fairly. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their motivations or offering alternative, suitable solutions. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could be seen as failing to provide appropriate guidance, potentially breaching the duty to act with due skill, care, and diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening to understand the client's request and underlying reasons. This should be followed by a comprehensive fact-finding process to gather all necessary information about the client's financial circumstances and objectives. Subsequently, the professional must analyze this information against regulatory requirements and the firm's internal policies to determine the most suitable course of action. If the client's request deviates from this, the professional must explain the rationale for alternative recommendations, clearly outlining the risks and benefits, and documenting all advice and client decisions. Question 11. What factors determine whether a client's request for a specific type of market analysis, which could potentially be interpreted as providing insider information, should be accepted or declined by an NOV employee, strictly adhering to the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework? Option A. The client's past business relationship with NOV and the perceived likelihood of the client acting unethically. Option B. The explicit wording of the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework concerning the prohibition of providing or facilitating the use of material non-public information, and the potential for the requested analysis to inadvertently lead to such a violation. Option C. The potential for the analysis to generate significant revenue for NOV and the client's stated intention for using the information. Option D. The clarity of the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework regarding the specific type of information requested, and the employee's personal interpretation of ethical boundaries. The correct answer is C. The potential for the analysis to generate significant revenue for NOV and the client's stated intention for using the information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at NOV to navigate a situation where a client's request, while seemingly straightforward, could potentially lead to a breach of regulatory compliance or ethical standards. The pressure to maintain client relationships and secure business must be balanced against the absolute priority of adhering to the NOV hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to identify potential conflicts and ensure that all actions taken are within the bounds of the law and ethical conduct. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework and its application to client interactions. This means recognizing that any request that could lead to noncompliance, even if not explicitly forbidden, must be scrutinized. The professional must prioritize adherence to the established rules and guidelines, even if it means declining or modifying the client's request. This aligns with the fundamental ethical obligation to act with integrity and uphold the reputation of NOV and the industry. Specifically, the NOV hiring assessment test's framework likely emphasizes principles of transparency, fairness, and adherence to all applicable regulations, making any action that circumvents these principles unacceptable. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without adequate due diligence, assuming that the client's intent is benign or that the request falls into a gray area. This demonstrates a failure to proactively identify and mitigate regulatory risks. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the client relationship or potential revenue over regulatory compliance. This reflects a misunderstanding of the absolute priority of the regulatory framework and an ethical lapse in judgment. A further incorrect approach might involve seeking to interpret the regulations in the most favorable light for the client, rather than applying them strictly and objectively. This can lead to unintentional breaches and a loss of credibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory requirements. When faced with a client request, they should ask, does this request, or any potential outcome of fulfilling it, violate any aspect of the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework? If there is any doubt, the next step is to seek clarification from internal compliance or legal departments. The decision should always err on the side of caution and prioritize compliance. This involves documenting the request, the assessment of its compliance, and the final decision, ensuring a clear audit trail. Question 12. The audit findings indicate that during a client review meeting, a client of NOV hiring assessment test expressed a strong desire to invest in a specific high-risk speculative product that is not permitted under the current regulatory guidelines applicable to NOV hiring assessment test. The client insists on this product, stating it's their sole focus. How should the NOV hiring assessment test representative proceed? Option A. Inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled and end the meeting, as the product is not allowed, without offering further discussion or alternatives. Option B. Advise the client that while the product is not directly permissible, there might be a way to structure the investment indirectly to circumvent the regulatory restrictions. Option C. Explain to the client that the requested product is not permissible under the applicable regulatory framework and discuss alternative investment options that align with their financial goals and risk tolerance while remaining compliant. Option D. Proceed with the client's request to invest in the speculative product, assuming the client understands the risks and is making an informed decision to maintain client satisfaction. The correct answer is C. Explain to the client that the requested product is not permissible under the applicable regulatory framework and discuss alternative investment options that align with their financial goals and risk tolerance while remaining compliant. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a conflict between a client's stated preferences and the regulatory requirements governing financial advice. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that advice provided is not only suitable for the client, but also compliant with the strictures of the NOV hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. This demands a careful balancing act, prioritizing regulatory adherence and client best interests over immediate client demands that may be misinformed or potentially detrimental. Correct approach involves prioritizing the regulatory framework and the client's best interests by explaining the limitations and offering compliant alternatives. This is ethically sound and legally mandated because financial professionals are bound by regulations to act in a fiduciary capacity, meaning they must place their clients' interests above their own and adhere to all applicable laws and guidelines. The NOV hiring assessment tests framework, by its nature, is designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. Therefore, any advice or product recommendation must align with these principles, even if it means gently pushing back against a client's initial, potentially unsuitable request. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without thoroughly explaining the regulatory implications or offering compliant alternatives. This fails to uphold the professional duty of care and could lead to regulatory breaches, client dissatisfaction, and potential harm to the client's financial well-being. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their underlying needs or educating them on compliant options. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and a failure to provide comprehensive, tailored advice. Finally, an approach that prioritizes securing the business over regulatory compliance is fundamentally unethical and illegal, as it compromises the integrity of the financial advice process. Professionals should approach such situations by first actively listening to and understanding the client's objectives. Then, they must clearly articulate the regulatory constraints and explain why certain requests may not be feasible or advisable. The next step is to proactively suggest alternative, compliant solutions that still aim to meet the client's underlying needs. This process fosters trust, educates the client, and ensures that all actions are conducted with the highest ethical and regulatory standards. Question 13. Compliance review shows that a long-standing client of NOV Financial, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, has requested to transfer a substantial sum of money from an overseas account held with a newly established, less regulated financial institution into his NOV investment portfolio. Mr. Pendleton has provided a brief explanation for the source of funds, citing a recent inheritance from a distant relative, but has been hesitant to provide detailed documentation beyond a basic confirmation from the overseas bank. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for NOV Financial? Option A. Immediately reject the transfer request and inform Mr. Pendleton that NOV Financial cannot accept funds from such an institution due to regulatory concerns. Option B. Accept the client's explanation without further inquiry and process the transfer, assuming the overseas bank has conducted its own due diligence. Option C. Conduct enhanced due diligence on the source of funds, including requesting further documentation from Mr. Pendleton and potentially verifying the overseas institution's legitimacy, while keeping Mr. Pendleton informed of the process. Option D. Proceed with the transfer as requested, as Mr. Pendleton is a valued long-term client and the explanation, while brief, is plausible. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the transfer as requested, as Mr. Pendleton is a valued long-term client and the explanation, while brief, is plausible. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the firm's regulatory obligations. The firm, NOV Financial, must navigate the delicate balance of client service while adhering strictly to the UK's Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) regulations and relevant anti-money laundering (AML) legislation. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and responding appropriately to potential red flags without unduly hindering legitimate business. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented investigation into the source of funds, engaging with the client to understand the transaction's purpose, and if necessary, escalating the matter internally for further review and potential reporting to the National Crime Agency, NCA, if suspicion of money laundering persists. This aligns with the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 1, Integrity, and Principle 3, Customers' Interests, and the Money Laundering Regulations 2017, which mandate robust customer due diligence, CDD, and suspicious activity reporting, SAR, procedures. The firm has a legal and ethical duty to prevent its services from being used for illicit purposes. An incorrect approach would be to immediately reject the client's request without proper investigation. This could be seen as a failure to uphold the duty of care to the client and could lead to reputational damage if the transaction is indeed legitimate. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without any further due diligence, despite the unusual nature of the funds. This would be a direct violation of AML regulations and expose NOV Vest Financial to significant regulatory penalties and reputational risk. Finally, accepting the client's explanation at face value without seeking independent verification or further documentation, especially given the large sum and unusual source, would also be a failure in due diligence. Professionals should employ a risk-based approach. This involves identifying potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and implementing appropriate controls. When faced with unusual transactions or client behavior, the decision-making process should involve 1. Gathering all relevant information. 2. Assessing the information against established policies and regulatory requirements. 3. Consulting with compliance or legal departments if uncertainty exists. And 4. Documenting all steps taken and decisions made. The ultimate goal is to protect the firm and the financial system from illicit activities while serving clients responsibly. Question 14. The audit findings indicate a potential misstatement in the financial reporting of NOV Capital Partners, specifically concerning the valuation of certain illiquid assets. Your direct manager, MS, Anya Sharma, has instructed you to adjust the valuation methodology to align with the previously reported figures, stating that this is a necessary step to avoid market concern. You are aware that this instruction may contravene the accounting standards NOV Capital Partners is required to follow. What is the most appropriate course of action for you to take in this situation? Option A. Ignore the audit findings and MS Sharma's instruction, continuing with the current valuation methodology without further action. Option B. Proceed with adjusting the valuation methodology as instructed by MS Sharma to maintain market confidence. Option C. Escalate the audit findings and MS Sharma's instruction to the head of compliance and the internal audit department. Option D. Discuss the audit findings and MS Sharma's instruction with a trusted colleague in another department to seek their opinion. The correct answer is C. Escalate the audit findings and MS Sharma's instruction to the head of compliance and the internal audit department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a conflict between a direct instruction from a superior and a potential breach of regulatory requirements. The core of the challenge lies in upholding ethical standards and regulatory compliance when faced with pressure to act otherwise. Careful judgment is required to identify the correct course of action that prioritizes integrity and adherence to the law over expediency or personal consequence. The correct approach involves escalating the concern through appropriate channels, such as the compliance department or a designated reporting line, rather than directly complying with the potentially non-compliant instruction. This upholds professional integrity by ensuring that regulatory frameworks are respected and that potential misconduct is addressed proactively. Specifically, this aligns with the principles of acting with integrity and maintaining competence and due care as outlined in professional conduct guidelines, which mandate reporting of suspected breaches. It also reflects the duty to comply with all applicable laws and regulations. An incorrect approach would be to directly comply with the manager's instruction without question. This fails to uphold the duty to comply with regulatory requirements and could expose both the individual and the firm to significant penalties. It demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and a failure to act with due care. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the instruction and do nothing. While this avoids direct complicity, it fails to address the potential regulatory breach identified by the audit findings. Professional responsibility often extends to taking action to rectify or report issues, not merely to avoid personal involvement. A further incorrect approach would be to discuss the audit findings and the manager's instruction with colleagues outside of the designated reporting channels. This could be construed as a breach of confidentiality and could lead to the dissemination of sensitive information, potentially prejudicing any investigation or internal processes. It undermines the structured and confidential nature of compliance and internal reporting mechanisms. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core issue. Is there a potential conflict with regulatory requirements or ethical standards? 2. Consulting relevant policies and regulations, referencing internal policies and applicable regulatory frameworks to understand the specific obligations. 3. Seeking guidance, escalating the concern through the appropriate internal channels, e.g., compliance, legal, HR, or a designated whistleblowing hotline to obtain clarification and direction. 4. Documenting actions, keeping a clear record of all communications and decisions made. 5. Prioritizing compliance and ethics, ensuring that all actions taken are in line with regulatory obligations and ethical principles, even if it means challenging a superior's instruction. Question 15. The risk matrix shows a potential discrepancy in the reporting of client transaction fees by the sales team at Global Financial Services, Inc. This discrepancy, if unaddressed, could lead to misstated financial reports and potential regulatory scrutiny. You have observed this firsthand. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Discuss your concerns with a trusted senior colleague in another department to get their opinion on how to proceed. Option B. Immediately contact the head of the sales team to discuss the discrepancy and ask them to correct it. Option C. Document the observed discrepancy with all relevant details and report it directly to the designated compliance officer. Option D. Ignore the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor oversight that will be corrected in the next reporting cycle. The correct answer is B. Immediately contact the head of the sales team to discuss the discrepancy and ask them to correct it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance competing priorities, the immediate need to address a potential compliance breach versus the established internal procedures for escalating such matters. The pressure to act quickly can lead to bypassing proper channels, which, while seemingly efficient, can undermine the integrity of the compliance framework and potentially lead to further complications. Careful judgment is required to ensure that immediate concerns are addressed without compromising the robustness and accountability of the firm's compliance processes. The correct approach involves adhering to the established internal reporting procedures for suspected compliance breaches. This means documenting the observed discrepancy and immediately reporting it to the designated compliance officer or department as per NOV hiring assessment test guidelines. This approach is professionally sound because it ensures that the matter is handled by individuals with the appropriate expertise and authority to investigate, assess the risk, and implement corrective actions in accordance with regulatory requirements. It also creates an auditable trail of the incident and the firm's response, which is crucial for demonstrating compliance to regulators. An incorrect approach would be to attempt to rectify the discrepancy directly without reporting it. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the firm's established compliance protocols, can lead to an incomplete understanding of the breach's scope and impact, potentially masking a systemic issue. Furthermore, it prevents the compliance department from fulfilling its oversight responsibilities and could result in a failure to meet regulatory obligations for reporting and remediation. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the potential breach with colleagues outside of the formal reporting structure before escalating it. This is professionally unsound as it risks the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information, potentially creating a perception of impropriety or prejudicing a future investigation. It also deviates from the principle of maintaining a clear and documented line of communication for compliance matters. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's internal compliance policies and procedures. When a potential compliance issue is identified, the immediate steps should be to 1. Document the observation factually. 2. Assess if the observation constitutes a potential breach of regulations or internal policy. And 3. Follow the prescribed escalation path to the relevant compliance personnel. This structured approach ensures that all potential issues are handled consistently, transparently, and in accordance with the regulatory framework. Question 16. The audit findings indicate that a significant number of new client onboarding records at NOV hiring assessment test contain inaccuracies in essential client identification details, potentially due to a combination of manual data entry errors and insufficient validation checks within the existing system. This situation raises concerns about compliance with internal data integrity policies and potential regulatory implications. Which of the following represents the most appropriate immediate course of action for NOV hiring assessment test? Option A. Issue a company-wide memo emphasizing the importance of data accuracy and instruct all employees to double-check their work without investigating the specific systemic or procedural issues. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client onboarding process to identify the root causes of the data inaccuracies, implement targeted corrective actions to address these causes, and reinforce training for personnel involved in data entry and validation. Option C. Immediately implement a new, more complex data entry system across all departments to prevent future errors, without a detailed analysis of the current system's specific failures. Option D. Focus solely on disciplinary actions against the individuals identified as having made the most errors, assuming the problem is primarily human error rather than a systemic issue. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client onboarding process to identify the root causes of the data inaccuracies, implement targeted corrective actions to address these causes, and reinforce training for personnel involved in data entry and validation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's need for efficient operations with the stringent regulatory requirements for client onboarding and data integrity. The auditor's findings highlight a potential breakdown in controls, which could expose NOV hiring assessment tests to significant compliance risks, including regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to determine the most appropriate course of action that rectifies the identified issues without causing undue disruption or violating any established protocols. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the root cause of the discrepancies identified by the audit. This includes reviewing the specific processes that led to the incorrect client data entry, identifying any systemic weaknesses in the onboarding workflow, and implementing corrective actions. These actions should be documented and communicated to relevant personnel to prevent recurrence. This approach aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance, ensuring that NOV hiring assessment test maintains accurate client records and adheres to its internal policies and any applicable regulatory guidelines concerning data management and client due diligence. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings as minor errors without further investigation. This fails to address the underlying control deficiencies and leaves NOV hiring assessment test vulnerable to future compliance breaches. It also demonstrates a lack of commitment to maintaining accurate records, which is a fundamental ethical and regulatory expectation. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately implement a blanket policy change without understanding the specific causes of the errors. This could lead to unnecessary operational burdens and may not effectively address the actual problem, potentially creating new issues. It bypasses the critical step of root cause analysis, which is essential for effective problem solving and compliance. A third incorrect approach would be to solely focus on disciplining the individuals involved without addressing the systemic issues. While accountability is important, a purely punitive response without examining and rectifying flawed processes is unlikely to prevent future errors and can foster a culture of fear rather than continuous improvement. This neglects the responsibility of management to ensure robust systems and training are in place. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, acknowledge and thoroughly investigate the audit findings. Second, identify the root cause of any identified issues. Third, develop and implement targeted corrective actions, including process improvements and training. Fourth, document all actions taken and monitor for effectiveness. Finally, communicate findings and resolutions to relevant stakeholders to foster transparency and accountability. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal that a new client, Global Ventures Limited, has submitted an incomplete application for a trading account with NOV Capital. While the provided information suggests a potentially high-value client, certain beneficial ownership details are vague, and the source of funds is not clearly articulated. The sales team is eager to onboard Global Ventures Limited, quickly to meet quarterly targets. Which of the following actions should the NOV Capital Compliance Department take? Option A. Delegate the responsibility of obtaining the missing information from Global Ventures Limited to the sales team, trusting their judgment to expedite the process. Option B. Escalate the incomplete application to the Senior Compliance Manager for a thorough review and request additional documentation from Global Ventures Limited to clarify the beneficial ownership and source of funds before proceeding. Option C. Immediately approve the account for Global Ventures Limited, as the sales team is pushing for a swift onboarding and the potential revenue is significant. Option D. Reject the account application for Global Ventures Limited, immediately due to the missing information, to avoid any potential regulatory risks. Correct answer is C. Immediately approve the account for Global Ventures Limited, as the sales team is pushing for swift onboarding and the potential revenue is significant. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's need for efficient client onboarding with the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough due diligence. The tension lies in the potential for a rushed process to overlook critical risk factors, thereby exposing the firm and its clients to illicit activities. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without unduly hindering business operations. The correct approach involves a structured, risk-based assessment of the client's profile and the nature of their proposed transactions. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations, which mandate that firms understand their clients and the risks they pose. Specifically, it requires the compliance team to escalate the matter for further investigation and potentially request additional documentation or clarification from the client before proceeding. This proactive stance is ethically sound and legally defensible, as it demonstrates a commitment to preventing financial crime and upholding regulatory standards. An incorrect approach that involves immediately approving the account without further scrutiny fails to adhere to the fundamental principles of due diligence. This bypasses the necessary risk assessment and could lead to the firm being used for money laundering or terrorist financing, resulting in severe regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential criminal liability. Another incorrect approach, which is to reject the client outright without a proper investigation, might be overly cautious and could lead to lost business opportunities. While risk mitigation is crucial, it must be balanced with a fair and objective assessment process. A third incorrect approach, which is to delegate the decision to the sales team without adequate oversight from compliance, creates a conflict of interest and undermines the integrity of the due diligence process. Sales teams are incentivized to close deals, which can lead to pressure to overlook red flags. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the potential risks and regulatory obligations. 2. Gathering all relevant information and assessing its completeness and accuracy. 3. Escalating any concerns or ambiguities to the appropriate compliance or legal department for expert review. 4. Documenting all decisions and the rationale behind them. 5. Ensuring that the process is consistently applied across all clients. Question 18. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a new investment product developed by Innovate Financial Services could generate substantial profits for the firm. However, the product carries a higher risk profile than the firm's current offerings, with a potential for significant client capital loss under certain market conditions. Innovate Financial Services is considering how to proceed with the product launch. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional and regulatory best practice? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment. Develop clear and transparent disclosures detailing all potential risks and their impact, and implement robust internal controls to manage these risks before launching the product. Option B. Launch the product immediately, focusing marketing efforts on the potential high returns and downplaying the associated risks to maximize early adoption and revenue. Option C. Delay the launch indefinitely, citing the inherent risks, thereby avoiding any potential client complaints or regulatory scrutiny, even if it means foregoing significant profit opportunities. Option D. Proceed with the launch, but only offer the product to a select group of existing high-net-worth clients who are presumed to have a higher risk tolerance, without extensive disclosure of the specific risks. The correct answer is B. Launch the product immediately, focusing marketing efforts on the potential high returns and downplaying the associated risks to maximize early adoption and revenue. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing potential business gains against ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The firm, Innovate Financial Services, is considering a new product that promises significant revenue but carries inherent risks that could impact clients. The challenge lies in ensuring that the pursuit of profit does not lead to a breach of fiduciary duty or regulatory mandates designed to protect investors. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate these risks effectively. The correct approach involves prioritizing client interests and regulatory adherence above immediate profit maximization. This means conducting a thorough risk assessment, ensuring transparent disclosure of all material risks to clients, and implementing robust internal controls to manage those risks. This approach aligns with the fundamental ethical principles of acting in the client's best interest and the regulatory requirement to ensure suitability of products for clients. Specifically, under the regulatory framework governing financial advisory services, assuming a jurisdiction like the UK for the purpose of this exam, referencing relevant principles from the FCA Handbook and SISI Code of Conduct, firms have a duty to act with integrity, skill, care, and diligence, and to treat customers fairly. The proposed product's potential for significant client detriment, even if offset by potential gains, necessitates a cautious and client-centric evaluation. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the product launch without fully understanding or disclosing the risks, or by downplaying their significance. This would represent a failure to act with integrity and in the best interests of clients, potentially violating the principle of treating customers fairly. Another incorrect approach would be to implement superficial risk mitigation measures that do not genuinely protect clients, thereby circumventing the spirit, if not the letter, of regulatory requirements. Such actions could lead to significant regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and legal liabilities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all potential impacts of a decision, both positive and negative, on all stakeholders, with a particular emphasis on clients and regulatory compliance. This involves a proactive risk identification and assessment process, followed by the development of mitigation strategies that are demonstrably effective and transparent. If the risks cannot be adequately mitigated to ensure client protection and regulatory compliance, the decision should be to not proceed with the product or service, regardless of potential profitability. Ethical considerations and regulatory obligations must always form the bedrock of any business decision in the financial services industry. Question 19. The performance metrics show a significant deviation in trading volumes for a particular asset class managed by NOV Capital. While this presents an opportunity to exceed quarterly profit targets, there is a concern that the unusual activity might be linked to market manipulation or insider information, which could contravene the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA Handbook, and SISI Code of Conduct. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation professionally? Option A. Halt all trading in the affected asset class and initiate an internal investigation into the performance metrics, consulting with NOV Capital's Compliance Department and Legal Counsel to ensure adherence to FCA regulations and SISI ethical standards before proceeding. Option B. Continue trading as normal, but instruct the trading team to be discreet about the unusual volume to avoid attracting regulatory attention. Option C. Immediately implement strategies to capitalize on the increased trading volume to meet profit targets, assuming the metrics reflect legitimate market forces. Option D. Adjust the reporting of the performance metrics to present a more favorable picture that aligns with previous trends, thereby mitigating immediate concerns about the deviation. The correct answer is C. Immediately implement strategies to capitalize on the increased trading volume to meet profit targets, assuming the metrics reflect legitimate market forces. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the company's immediate financial interests with their regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities. The pressure to meet performance targets can create a temptation to overlook or misinterpret regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is essential to ensure that actions taken are not only commercially beneficial, but also compliant and ethically sound, thereby protecting both the company and the integrity of the financial markets. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective review of the performance metrics in light of the relevant regulatory framework. This means understanding the specific rules and guidelines that govern the company's operations and ensuring that any actions taken to improve performance are fully compliant. The regulatory framework for this exam, which is assumed to be the UK regulatory framework and SISI guidelines, mandates that all financial professionals act with integrity, due skill, care, and diligence, and in the best interests of clients and the market. Specifically, it requires adherence to rules regarding market abuse, insider dealing, and accurate reporting. Therefore, any interpretation of performance metrics must be grounded in these principles, prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct over short-term gains that might arise from non-compliant activities. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on achieving the performance targets without considering regulatory implications is professionally unacceptable. This could involve misrepresenting data, engaging in manipulative trading practices, or failing to report suspicious activity, all of which violate fundamental regulatory principles. For instance, if an approach suggests interpreting ambiguous performance data in a way that allows for aggressive, potentially non-compliant strategies, it fails to uphold the duty of due skill, care, and diligence. Another incorrect approach might be to ignore potential red flags within the performance metrics, assuming they are merely statistical anomalies, rather than investigating them for potential regulatory breaches. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a failure to act in the best interests of the market. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the relevant regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Second, objectively assess the situation and the available data, considering all potential interpretations. Third, evaluate the implications of each potential course of action against the regulatory and ethical framework. If there is any doubt or ambiguity, seek guidance from compliance departments or senior management. Prioritize compliance and ethical conduct, even if it means foregoing immediate financial gains. Question 20. The audit findings indicate that a recent marketing campaign by Innovate Financial Services may have inadvertently presented performance projections that could be interpreted as misleading under the relevant regulatory guidelines. Your direct supervisor has instructed you to proceed with the campaign as planned, stating that the interpretation is overly cautious and that the firm has always operated this way. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Ignore the audit findings and the supervisor's instruction and continue with your regular duties, hoping the issue is resolved by others. Option B. Attempt to subtly adjust the marketing materials to mitigate the perceived risk without formally raising the issue with compliance. Option C. Escalate your concerns about the audit findings and the potential regulatory implications of the marketing campaign to the firm's compliance department for review and guidance. Option D. Proceed with the marketing campaign as instructed by your supervisor, assuming their interpretation of the regulatory guidelines is correct. Correct answer is C. Escalate your concerns about the audit findings and the potential regulatory implications of the marketing campaign to the firm's compliance department for review and guidance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a conflict between a direct instruction from a superior and a potential breach of regulatory requirements. The core of the challenge lies in upholding ethical standards and regulatory compliance when faced with pressure to act in a manner that could be construed as misleading or non-compliant. Careful judgment is required to identify the potential risks and to respond appropriately without jeopardizing the firm's integrity or personal professional standing. The correct approach involves escalating the concern through the appropriate channels within the firm, rather than directly complying with the potentially problematic instruction or ignoring it. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. Specifically, it involves clearly articulating the concerns regarding the audit findings and the proposed action to the compliance department or a designated senior manager responsible for regulatory oversight. This ensures that the issue is reviewed by individuals with the authority and expertise to make a compliant decision, thereby protecting both the firm and the individual from potential regulatory sanctions or reputational damage. This aligns with the principles of professional integrity and the duty to act in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. An incorrect approach would be to directly implement the instruction without further inquiry. This fails to acknowledge the potential regulatory implications highlighted by the audit findings and could lead to a breach of the regulatory framework. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a willingness to overlook potential noncompliance under pressure. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the instruction and the audit findings, hoping the issue will resolve itself. This is professionally irresponsible as it neglects a known risk and fails to address a potential regulatory breach. It also fails to uphold the duty to act with integrity and to report concerns. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt to fix the issue internally without involving the appropriate compliance or legal functions, perhaps by subtly altering the data or explanation without formal approval. This is a form of deception and can lead to more serious regulatory violations, as it involves actively misrepresenting information rather than addressing the root cause of the concern through proper channels. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's internal policies and procedures for reporting compliance concerns. It requires an objective assessment of the audit findings and the proposed action against the relevant regulatory framework. When in doubt, seeking guidance from compliance, legal, or a trusted senior colleague is paramount. The decision-making process should prioritize ethical conduct and regulatory compliance above all else, even when faced with pressure from superiors.